Laura Freeman. I'm Programme Officer at the Safety and Violence Initiative. So this panel is entitled Assessing and Investigating Homicide. What now? I think that's the biggest question. We have a homicide case, what happens? What are the consequences? What are the effects? How do we record it? How do we evaluate it? Etc. And this panel, as you can see from the agenda, promises to be as broad and varied, and I'm certain as interesting as this colloquium as a whole. So we're going from looking at murder of police officials in the Western Cape, to child homicide, to molecular markers for skin colour, to looking at big data management and processing and how that may assist in homicide investigation. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Gráinne Perkins, or should I say Detective Sergeant, who has a very varied and interesting background. I had no idea, I'm a few officers down from Gráinne, I had no idea that her original background is in zoology. So, original degree in zoology, then joined the Irish police as a detective sergeant, then a master's in criminology from Queen's University in Belfast, then a master's in public administration from the University of Ulster, and now a PhD in the University of Cape Town, going back to criminology. So welcome.
Goeiemorgen, Mulwani, good morning, and in Irish, Steve. Thank you, Laura. Yes, a very varied career. I'm standing before you today as a researcher, so my police cap is firmly back in the closet. The title today, it's not going to be seen on a t-shirt anytime soon, it's quite large. It essentially is Danger and Death, and that's what I'm looking at. This paper is part, I suppose, a subcomponent of my doctoral research project, which is a project that deals with the formal and informal responses of the South African Police Service to the murder of their own. It's hoping to focus between 2002 to 2014 in terms of the years that we're looking at. So that's where I suppose we will kick off, if I don't break the machine. No, we'll go with this one. Okay, the overview of the presentation today. A brief introduction. There'll be a synopsis of what we know about police murder so far from a North America perspective and a South African. It's going to be very brief because what we know about it is quite brief in and of itself. And the statistics really, just to give you a snapshot of what we know about it. Hopefully the bulk of my observations today will be the majority of the speech. Really to give you an idea of my preliminary observations so far. I'd love to say findings, but I'm not there yet. I'm a year and a half into the research and still in the depths of field work. So as far as an introduction, how do you go about researching danger? How do you go about trying to examine the murder of police officers in this country? You could look at statistics, that's one avenue, but really this research is concerned with looking at the whole idea of homicide from the inside out. So we rolled up our sleeves and decided an ethnographic approach was the best way to proceed. I'm 6 months into participant observation with the SAPs. I've been blessed with access all areas in terms of visible police units, detectives, tactical response team. I've negotiated my way onto a couple of their courses, close quarter combat and self-defence courses, much to people's surprise of, the police actually do these types of courses. 6 months in, about 750 hours of field observations, which works out to about 35, 40-hour work week with the police themselves. Why? Why danger? It's on the same spectrum as death. Where it sits on it, we don't know. But ultimately, what we can presume is that these dangerous situations lead to the death of the police officers. Or do they? Okay. American research. It's not the go-to. And it seems to be for a lot of our research. But the problem with researching police murders is the lack of incidents. So it's not a priority on people's radar, particularly from a research perspective. But in the North American case, there's over 18,000 police agencies. I'm going to say that again, 18,000. There's one in South Africa. Now, all these police agencies feed the information into the FBI. It's done centrally in terms of collating the statistics they have. It's been established since 1945, and every year the unpackaging of the statistics gets better and better in terms of what they decide to look at. On average, there's 64 police killed a year. There's over 1 billion people. There's billions and billions of people in the States, so you have to take that into context when I throw up the numbers from the South African perspective. From a literature point of view, the majority of literature really is a recital of these events as they're unpacked statistically. I've picked out a few that I think could be pertinent to the South African situation if the research actually looks at it through this American lens. The first one is cities with the highest violent crime rates, more officers are killed, which for a lot of people in this field, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but I think it's still something that has to be said, particularly when we think of the mapping that was put up yesterday by the girls from the ISS in terms of, you can see a bloat in one area and not understand why. Population has to be taken into account. The one that really, I don't want to say I like because then it sounds bad, but I like it in terms of another way of looking at police murders. 3/4 of all police murders in the States are as a direct result of officer-initiated actions. The officer wasn't directed to the incident, they weren't directed to the complaint. They took it upon themselves. 3/4 of all their deaths. So, in plain English, are they actually getting themselves killed? A common call, and it's an echo that comes right down to the Southern Hemisphere, is a call for harsher sentences, harsher punishments to deal with the offenders, because the echo is an attack on a police officer is an attack on the state. Evidence we have from the States is there's absolutely no evidence to support the idea that harsher punishments, or indeed calls for the death penalty, add police any added measure of protection, none whatsoever. The evidence just doesn't support it. And finally, 2014 actually is the most recent piece of research that's come out. And I like this, I think, because my research is focusing in township environments where officers, when they're deployed, as Guy pointed out, in relation to large-scale operations, they don't go out on their own, they go out in convoy. Multiple officers, when they're involved in an incident, the likelihood of them being assaulted is increased. So more officers attend, the chance of them getting killed is actually greater. So that's really just to give you an idea of the American situation. South African research, one police agency, law enforcement and Metro, will suck them in with this just for the sake of today. On average, 99 police killed a year. Again, it's hard to compare like with like because we're looking at populations. But I tried to pull together numbers just to try and get a handle on, is it really that bad? If you compare England and Wales, the general population, and their 43 constabularies combined, if you look at the murder of police officers over the last 10 years, the rate at which South African police officers are being killed is a rate of 88 to 1. You're losing 88 to everyone that's being killed in England. I suppose statistically, this is a nice one from 2013 that the South African Police Service provided, and interestingly enough, last week in Parliament I was at the presentation where they were speaking about preventative measures for police officers, and interestingly the suicide bar wasn't included in their graph. Suicide is on that continuum, it's on the spectrum, and it has to be included in this discussion. And I was surprised, I don't think any of our abstracts actually have looked at it either. It's identical to the American situation. We can't get statistics from America because FBI don't actually keep them, they're held locally. But there's an estimated 3 to 4 times number of deaths to suicide as opposed to officers being murdered on off-duty. Off-duty, in fairness, it's highlighted. The numbers are coming down, but more officers are still being killed off-duty. The SAPs, what they did say was VISPOL, the Visible Policing Section, more likely to be killed as far as the profile of the victim. Responding to complaints, they indicate that's when an officer is more likely to be killed. And the profile of the officer aged 30 to 40 with 3 to 6 years service. Now compared to the American stats, the service of the officers killed have over 10, on average 13 years service. So that there's a big a comparison there in terms of the service of the members themselves. Interestingly, scrolling through the presentation that the South African Police Service gave, it was a 42-page, fairly comprehensive presentation to the Portfolio Committee, who, in fairness, that committee, they don't take things lightly. They actually really went through the presentation well. But in those 42 pages, there was not one mention of the word victim. And it touches back on something that Gráinne mentioned yesterday. Are they allowed to be victims? Who's a real victim? To talk about police deaths and not have the word victim, it still surprises me, I suppose. A large echo as well, and it goes back to the research. Minar, I'll fly through the research on this because it's very skinny on the ground. Goldstone Commission, going back to apartheid, was when really it was initiated. Out of the 254 committees set up, they set up one to look at police killings in South Africa, and no big surprise, they put it down to the entrenchment, historical entrenchment of what police meant in South Africa. They were perceived as the enemy of the state and the apartheid state at that, so killing them was seen as justified. Fast forward to 2000, political rallying, the then Deputy President Mbike basically alluded to the fact that police were being killed in this country because they were friends with all the criminals and they were half criminals themselves, which was probably one of the best statements made because it instigated a multidisciplinary committee being set up in 2000. Anthony Minar led that committee. It was an academically explored area, which was fantastic because it's the only thing we have on police murders as far as a qualitative approach as well as the quantitative approach. The one thing that I like about that research is he basically says that a large portion of the incidents relate to officers being murdered for their firearms. It's not an overwhelming motive. And when offenders were interviewed, they actually said that they had no beef with the police at all. It was as a result of an ambush, or they wanted firearms come in second, but it wasn't the primary motive. Now, anyone who's conducted field research with the police, the first thing they'll say to you is they believe it's for their firearms. So perception and truth is something really that we're trying to, I suppose, unpack and have an idea what's going on. Now, I'll try and lash through the rest of this. These are photographs from my field work. No cops were harmed in the taking of any of these photos, so I'll put that out there now. As I said, how do we understand danger? I'm Irish, so storytelling is in my DNA, and unfortunately for the police, it's part of a well-known culture to try and dramatise stories, and I'll quite happily take that hat today to keep you engaged. Environment and danger, township environments, new to me. It's hard not to be overwhelmed to go into an area where danger is such a complex topic that we think of it as a physical entity. It's something that happens to people. In township environments, it's the absence of something that was overwhelming, the lack of roads, the lack of lighting, which from a police perspective, really, you've already met danger before you see it. I packed this, I suppose, to try and unpack that concept of danger. What I've done is looked at the police officers themselves into two different categories. Because it's such a complex topic, we looked at it from action men and avoidance men. It was the easiest way I could unpack the idea in my head. And I say men generically because obviously women are in the police as well. The relationship the police have with danger, that became a central issue for me, and it became an issue on the first day that when I looked at the idea of action men, that's from the back of one of the patrol cars. There's different types of action. On the first day of field work, I actually thought it's going to be my last, to be brutally honest with you. We were at a service delivery protest, standing outside a car redirecting traffic from rubbish that had been strewn in the road, and the driver of the car started to scream, "They're going to kill that boy, they're going to kill that boy." And I turned to see a lad of about 18 running across a concourse in a pair of boxer shorts with blood coming from his head, being chased by about 15 guys with rocks. And I thought, what? Jumped in the car, the obligatory handbrake turn, it's an essential thing in an important police chase. Followed them down to a shack area. And what happened, there's investigations into things happening in slow motion. This was definitely a slow motion. The passenger and the driver jumped out of the car, the two firearms came out, and they ran into the crowd, into the shack to try and find this guy. I obviously jumped out the back of the car and went for my torch, because it's going to be really useful in the middle of the day. But the idea of the action men, they became part of a dangerous situation. They became invisible. Order maintenance didn't exist. And I actually stood and watched as the police tried to locate this one fella. The guys with the rocks ran by them, ran through them. Their presence meant absolutely nothing, and yet they still engaged with it. 5 minutes later, we got separated from the car that was behind us and located them frog marching this youth across a field. And the crowd started to swell. It was like something out of a soapy. Women and children came out of shacks. We pulled up beside them in the car, and the driver of the car started to speak to the youth there in Izzy Posa. And I've never experienced, I genuinely thought this is going to be really ironic. My first day of field work and I'm dead. I stopped counting after 50 because people literally swarmed around the car and started to lean on it to get a better sight of what was going on. The daylight, the back windscreen in the car, I couldn't actually see out. And I thought this engagement with danger and how the officer spoke to the youths that were gathered there, there's a relationship thing there. And it's something I speak about in the paper, that it's gone back to the original semantics of danger, that originally it was to do with a jurisdictional issue, its power, its status. But somehow, and we can see from the conference over the last 2 days, danger and death has become automatically associated with violence. It's hitched violence onto the back of it. And it's not something new, it's something that has progressed, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And that relationship issue was something I suppose that this incident drove home to me. That's the idea of encountering danger. Normalising danger, I suppose the other incident was 2 o'clock in the morning with 4 guys. They decided that they wanted to do a foot patrol in a squatter camp, as you do. They rang control over the radio and said, "Control, just to let you know, we're going to go out on a foot patrol and we've no radio with us." You know, accountability at all times. And the controller came over the radio and said, "Well, if you're going to go out on a foot patrol with no radio, what are you going to do if you need help?" And I'm sitting in the back of the car thinking, that's a good point, actually. And an unknown voice came over the radio and said, "They will all die, Control." And they nearly got sick laughing. The 4 guys with me thought this was the funniest thing ever. And then off we walked into the squatter camp. The action men was there, that they had normalised a sense of danger to the point that they actually went to seek it. Action and avoidance. Avoidance, again, it's a difficult thing to try and decipher or identify within the police. Brewer in Northern Ireland spoke about it, how they spoke about danger, but funny, avoidance wasn't one of the topics he touched upon. Most obvious avoidance, particularly in townships areas, in the majority, females do not go outside. If you go into a township station, the majority of female officers are inside in the station. And it's something I picked up on and actually asked the lads and the girls about. And one of the guys said to me, in relation to why aren't the women going outside, and he said to me, "It's dangerous here. They, i.e. the women, are afraid. The scollies, they don't see the woman. If it was 1 man and 3 women, they just see 1 man." And it's that idea of danger, wow, it's actually got a gender identity now as well. When I asked the women about it, they said, Moss, it's dangerous. They push a woman, then they take her gun, and then they shoot her. So it wasn't just the males who were saying it, it was being echoed by the females as well. Avoidance in the field. Lorena, there's your Casper. I don't know if it's very clear on that. I suppose I'd just say this Casper was actually at a rally to prevent police deaths. Very symbolic, I thought. Paint the thing white so it'll be a bit more peaceful looking. Avoidance in the field. How can you tell that it's not the fact they're just being lazy and they don't want to go to the call? How can you say it's self-preservation? Or how can you say it's fear? It's one of those things that it's very difficult to observe, and I think that's where the beauty of field work and observation comes into it. You get to know the participants a bit better. You get an idea of what they will and they won't do. The one incident that really stood out for me was, surprisingly enough, another service delivery complaint. Service delivery call came in, and it basically escalated to the point that shots were being fired, the school was being set on fire, the rocks, the full Monty was in full swing. 1 car was actually caught up in it, as far as 1 police car was caught up in it. Every car in the cluster was redeployed to this call, as was the car I was in. And the 2 guys in the car basically got back onto control and said, we're actually dealing with another call that's, the other side of the cluster, so we'll finish dealing with that. And the driver knew someone else had already gone to that call. Now, these two particular guys, this wasn't laziness. I'd worked with them, I'd seen them in action, I'd seen what they did. We sat on the periphery of this call and listened to the events unfold over the radio like it was a soccer match. There was little comments like, oh, he was lucky there, when there was another shot fired. And to me, it was the clearest avoidance of danger that I'd seen to date in the field in terms of they knew what was involved. They knew the possibility of being injured. It wasn't due to the fact they had to clock off, 10 minutes later and it would have interrupted their schedule. They didn't want to go. And I think that has to be recognised in terms of our idea of how the police construct and relate to that idea of danger and how that danger then gets packaged into this idea of them being killed. I suppose we've looked at the past, we've looked at the present. Where to next? Like any good PhD student, I'm hoping to gather more data in the next 6 months. The fieldwork's going to go on for another 6 months in another township environment. We're accessing the dockets with the cooperation of the SAPs in terms of the number of members killed here in the last 10 years to really unpackage what we know about the murder, right down to weight, date of birth, where they married, stuff that's going to reflect some of the narrative from the North American context. Most of the research has been external, and I think this is really, even in Minar's study back in 2000, it wasn't external, but there was no inside-out view, and I'm hoping that's what this research will do, provide a perspective on police killings from the inside out, and hopefully be able to contribute to the development of strategies to prevent any further police killings. While I have the floor, I couldn't include the slide because I know she would have taken it out. It's really just to publicly thank my supervisor, who could be sent to an early grave with my research yet, Professor van der Spooy, and my co-supervisor on it is Dr. Kelly Moult. Gurv Mila Malgav, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gráinne. I think you're conducting really valuable and fascinating research in the field at no small danger to yourself, by the sounds of it. Let me introduce our next speaker, Lorna Martin. Reading your biography is impressive, I think is the single word. From medical degree and then increasing levels of specialization into forensic medicine. I won't go through the full biography, but in 2004, when Lorna became Chief Specialist and Head of Division of the Department of Clinical Laboratory Sciences at UCT, she was the first woman and youngest person to be appointed as Head of Division. And I think you've really continued that, and I'm sure leading the way in the field. So we're very much happy to have you here and looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So what I want to talk about is child homicide and just some findings from studies that we've been doing, just to give a different perspective and maybe follow on a little bit from what Sebastian was talking about a bit earlier today. So the first study is complete, and it was our first national child homicide study. It's a mortuary-based study, and I did it in conjunction and collaboration with colleagues from the MRC, from the Gender and Health Research Unit at the MRC. And then following on from that study, we developed a process of child death reviews, which is something that's ongoing. The results of which are not yet published in any peer review publications, but I have some research policy briefs that people can have if they're interested in. So just to have a look at child homicide, and we did the first study in the background of a national female murder study, which was conducted in 2009, and that was our second national female murder study, the first having been done in 1999. And the reasons why we wanted to include children in the second study are up there on the slide for you all to read, but also because we developed the tool for collection of the data at the mortuaries, it wasn't much more of a step to start including data on children as well. And there was no published data on homicide rates and the details around those child homicides that was mortuary based. So that's why we decided to do it. So what we did, as I've explained, a mortuary based study, and mortuary based in terms that we sent qualified, or not qualified, trained field workers to the mortuaries to go and collect our data, not just from the mortuary registers, but also from the post-mortem reports. Having said that, all the post-mortem reports for both of these studies were read and analyzed, and the data was collected by one poor individual who will never do it again, that being me, because there were thousands of reports, and my colleagues who have attempted to do similar things, one of whom is sitting here, will probably never do it again either, because it's a lot of work. However, it did give us a lot of valuable information around those homicides. So we sampled 38 mortuaries spread across all of the provinces. I think there are about 120 odd, might be wrong, maybe 140 mortuaries in the country, but not all are of the same size, as you can see there. Some are rural, some are urban. So our statistician on the team took all of that into account so that we had a generalizable sample and a properly representative sample. We did all of that to make sure that the statistics and the data was clean and proper. But some of the things that we collected was obviously the cause of death, the demographic details of the victims, blood alcohol concentrations where we had them, and we were a little bit, we were sort of luckier than NIMS, for instance, in that we had connections to laboratories and could get those results a little bit quicker. It doesn't happen anymore, I have to say. I've left the stuff in about fetuses and concealments, and I've got one slide just because of what we spoke about yesterday. Just to mention that non-viable fetuses are not included in the data. We also interviewed police officers where there was an IO on that homicide case to be able to collect that data. Those are the definition of terms that we used for the study. And what did we find? So from the 2009 data, we found that 3 children were murdered per day in South Africa, that it gave us a child homicide rate of 5.5 per 100,000 children, children being defined as somebody less than 18. You can see the differences between the male and female homicide rate, and I'll show you the breakdown of that. So those are the rates in terms of age categories, and you can see as children get older, men become the victims of the homicide, as sort of reflects, doesn't it, the young adults and adults in interpersonal violence figures. The scenes, I think we saw this yesterday as well, home, other home and public space, and you see for the female homicides it's mainly at home, and for male homicides it's mainly in public spaces. Victim-perpetrator relationships, very interestingly, that female children are killed by their mothers, more than male children are. And strangers, there's basically no difference between girls and boys, but that known person category, with the majority of male homicides being there, is for the older children, as you'll see in a minute. Mechanism of death by gender. You can see there that there's a variety, well, the variety that we've heard about over the past 2 days of firearm, sharp, blunt strangulation. Interestingly, if you look at the strangulation asphyxiation, it's girl children being killed by their mothers, mainly, who succumb to that mechanism of death, or that cause of death. Also, I've left there the abandoned babies, and so abandoned babies would have been what's also known as concealment of birth, as the police charge, and it would be live births, and it included stillbirths in this instance, and the majority of those are female. In terms of guns and child homicide, you will see there that 11.5% of the homicides were due to firearm deaths. mainly on male children, and the majority in the young adolescent or the sort of teenage group, and, as I've said, male. In terms of fatal child abuse, so we had a look at that, and I had put the definition up earlier, but if you look at the abuse cases versus the non-abuse cases, and the differentiation in age category, you'll see that the girl children are more likely to succumb to fatal child abuse than boy children are in the younger age group. And what we found was in 2009 that 45% of all child homicides were related to child abuse or to neglect, which gave a fatality rate of 2.4 per 100,000. And what did I put up for overall homicides? 5.5 or something. And that there is a gender difference, which I've mentioned. And there you can see the gender difference quite clearly in terms of the female age category, which is significantly different from 5 upwards. We also had a look at rape and child homicide, and it was suspected in about 10% of all of our cases, mainly affecting girls. Those are the figures for the boys and girls in terms of rape, and you can see there clearly that girls are most affected. We had a look at teenagers, just 2 slides to show that it's mainly in public spaces and it's mainly men, and that's why the majority are in the public spaces, is because of the occupancy of that category by the men. And it follows what we've seen for the past few days, that weekends, as my colleague said, is the time to go outside, get drunk and pick a fight and die, generally. And our teenagers do the same thing. There's the blood alcohol results for the teenagers, and you can see that a lot of them are positive, of the ones where we had taken alcohol and where we had a result. It's something we debate at work around when do we take blood alcohol from one of our cases. Do we just take it in everybody, or do we take it from 18 and up, or do we take it from 12 and up, or should there be an age when we don't take a blood alcohol test on a case at our mortuary? There it is divided, child homicide victims with their blood alcohol concentration and mechanism of death. And you can see that with sharp and blunt, maybe not significantly, but the victims are more likely to have had alcohol in them compared to the victims who are being shot. So this was one of the interesting things, and it led us to the child death reviews, is that after having gone through all of the autopsy reports and the police investigations, and hopefully it fits into this panel around investigation of homicide, is that there are cases falling through the cracks. In some of the mortuaries, there were just no case numbers for some of the cases that we had identified as being murders, especially in the Eastern Cape at the time. But for instance, this case, where an 8-month-old female baby had died in a private hospital in Joburg, it was a subdural hematoma, taken there after having arrested at the daycare center. And the hospital, so just to step backwards, subdural hematoma, subarachnoid cerebral, all of that is straight away you need to know that that's not a natural way to die. So somebody should have been alerted to the fact that there was something untoward. So the hospital were alerted, and they said to the mom, please will you go and open a case at the police station, which never happened because the mom was a police officer. Don't know why at the time. And then subsequently we found out that there was the possibility of the caregiver themselves being involved in the death of the child. So those kinds of things. There are many other examples that we found. So the 2009 study showed us that there are 3 children dying a day from homicide, and that there were distinct specific things highlighted by the study, as you can read there, and that a lot of them were preventable. So what do we do about that? What do we do with the information? And it's like all the information we've heard the past few days from these kinds of presentations is, here's all the data, so what do you do with it? So we decided to form a child death review team. It's based on international best practice, and there are many other countries who do it. And the background, which I've now just presented to you, is why we decided to do it. and what I haven't mentioned is that we noted in the 2009 study that child homicides were not a great priority for the police. That a lot of, or three-quarters of the fatal child abuse cases were under 5. These are the children that can least protect themselves. And that nearly half are killed in the context of fatal child abuse. So there are very preventable issues here and things where interventions can be put in place. And importantly, that social services were really lacking in all of the investigations that we had looked at. So we wanted to unpack all of that and understand how and why children are dying, and as I've said, what can we do about it? And is it feasible in our setting to set up such a multidisciplinary task team to sit once a month and actually investigate all of these deaths? And so we're 18 months into that. We've developed the multidisciplinary team, and I've got a slide to say where we are all from. We do have monthly team meetings. We review every single child death at those monthly meetings. Again, I might want to shoot myself because not having learned from the studies that I've done previously and the amount of work that's involved, I am the forensic pathologist on this child death review team in Cape Town. And I'm trying to encourage my colleagues to help me so that I can get some more sleep. But at this point in time, they're not that interested because they've got so many cases themselves. So this is the team. It's a coordinator. And in our instance, in Cape Town, it's the director of the Children's Institute, who was my fellow collaborator when she was at the MRC. And so that's why we've continued this work. And I have to say, this is something very new for me, this children thing. My entire life was about violence against women. So I've been dragged into children, and the least said, the better about that. So there's a senior forensic pathologist, a senior state advocate, a senior police officer, somebody from the Children's Directorate of DSD, a pediatric specialist, an epidemiologist, and then a slave. So, and we have that, the PhD intern. At two sites, Cape Town and Salt River Mortuary and Phoenix Mortuary in KZN. And we've been doing it now for 18 months, and the results of the first year, and that's what's in those research policy documents, if anybody's interested. I'm going to present some of them. Okay, so what we do is we clarify the cause of death. So often, at the time of the production of the draft or provisional PM report, the cause of death is not always obvious. It might be, but the pathologist will say undetermined because they're waiting for a lot of ancillary tests to come back. So we want to know every month what is the most likely cause of death. So we discuss that amongst ourselves and decide on what the most likely cause of death is and where the investigation should go from there, and not waiting for the inquest or the criminal trial, which can come years later. So an inquest in Cape Town is about a 2 to 5 year process after the person has died. And if any of you in this room have lost anybody in Cape Town, you may know that for the estate to be wound up, the insurance to pay out, all of those things can take that long, unfortunately. So at the meetings, we can identify if additional information is required, and because we've got a senior state advocate from the DPP's office, she instructs, which is really great. She can instruct the detective to go and do the following things. And it gets done straight away, and it's a prosecutor-led investigation from the outset. So all of those cases are on Bonnie's desk straight away. And then we can identify preventable or remedial factors. So this is what we found. Okay, that's not helpful. The majority are unnatural, the green, but we have a large percentage of natural cases. Let me give you some numbers. There you go. That the majority of natural cases are seen at Salt River Mortuary as opposed to Phoenix, and that's very interesting, and it's another conversation for another day, but it relates to the admission of cases within the Forensic Pathology Service nationally, and how this province is interpreting the mandate in its broadest sense, which we think we should be doing in terms of the definition of what an unnatural death is, one of which is any sudden, unexpected and unexplained death must be admitted to a forensic pathology facility. So we take all of those deaths and then investigate them, and in children a lot of them turn out to be natural. But if you look at the overall profile of the cases, you'll see 15% are homicides. And there it is divided. Now I'm going to rush through because I'm out of time. But cause of death profile by age. The far majority of the natural cases are in the youngsters and in the infants, so for the clinicians. And what this has done is our clinicians are very interested in what we're finding in the natural causes in neonates and in the less than ones. And so that's a whole other thing that's going on and creating more work for us. Because our mandate is not to investigate natural death. So we can look at a baby at the mortuary, take a history, perhaps do an x-ray and say, that's it, it's a natural cause. We do not open them up and we do not do the full investigation. Clearly, clinicians would really like us to do that because they want to know what the pathology is. We're interested in kids who've been shot and run over and stoned and things like that. So there's the top 10 specific causes of death. You see homicide is the second. Those are the two mortuaries combined. LRTI is low respiratory tract infection. So 15% of our cases at those two mortuaries are children being murdered. Pattern of injury deaths, so the unnatural deaths, those are the patterns. The electrocutions is interesting. It's mainly in KZN, and we're going to go and unpack that further. We hardly had any electrocutions in Cape Town. And then the transport engineer, I think, has gone. But road traffic injury is there. And what to do with children is interesting. So homicide by age, you can see as you grow up as a child, oh no, sorry, that's just per mortuary. I thought it was per gender. Scene, let me run through this. Abuse versus non-abuse. Basically, it reflects what we found in the 2009 study. But to manage the investigation, what we have been able to do is 50 cases of that 711 were referred for social services. They weren't fatal child abuse, and it didn't have to be reported in terms of legislation on a Form 22, but we made a referral to social services anyway, and they went and investigated those households. And of those 50, 28 were confirmed as neglect or omission of care, and social services have intervened in those cases. So in terms of investigating and following up and intervening, we feel we're doing something quite positive. So there's the concealment of birth. We had 20 cases. And of those 20, there's some of them which are quite clearly murders. So the police take those babies that are found dumped anyway, get admitted, or get the case that's opened is a concealment of birth. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's for us then to decide, is it a stillbirth, a live birth, a viable, non-viable, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. In terms of homicide, so this would have never happened within 7 months had we not been doing these child death reviews. This would have just gone on in the criminal justice system. But because we have these, and because we have a prosecutor at those meetings who knows immediately about the case, directly basically from the mouth of the pathologist, they can investigate straight away. So I'm out of time, but I'm around for anybody to talk to afterwards, and please read the findings in there. Thank you.
I'm so sorry I had to stop you there, Lorna. Incredibly interesting research, and I think really showing the power of interdisciplinary work, and how when people from multiple disciplines come together, they can be very active agents in investigations and research and giving us fuller pictures about homicide and child abuse more generally. Let me introduce our next speaker, Nandi Slabbert. One of our postgraduate contributors. Is so interesting to see all the very exciting work that postgraduate researchers are doing at UCT, and we have a great contingent from forensic medicine, where Nandi is also located at the moment doing her master's degree. She has 2 bachelor degrees, which is quite remarkable. The one in forensic science and the other in criminology and criminal justice, which are very interesting. And we'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Okay, so before I start my presentation, I want you all to picture the scenario. A homicide has occurred, and except for some unknown DNA found under the victim's fingernails, there's practically no other evidence. No eyewitnesses, no suspects, no leads, just a dead end. It's not really that hard to imagine. Unlike on TV, DNA doesn't magically give us the name and the address of our suspect. We need a reference sample or a DNA database match for comparison purposes. If we don't have that, we're back where we started, a dead end. Now imagine I can tell you that from that DNA, I can give you a suspect profile. Well, we don't have to use our imaginations anymore. We are now able to predict physical characteristics from molecular markers. My topic today is how this method of trait prediction, known as phenotyping, can be used as a forensic investigation tool. And I will be discussing the concerns and ethical issues with the application of this method within the South African population. Now, a phenotype is observable traits. These can be shapes or functions, and they are influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. This results in a high variability, as can be seen in different eye colors. Now, this diversity is due to genetic variations known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Now, these are single base pair substitutions located at specific locations within the gene between individuals. And with some of these SNPs occurring within coding regions of the DNA, can result in a gene function change. Now, due to this gene function alteration, some of these molecular variations have been linked to specific traits, as can be seen in facial features or hair, eye, and skin color. Now, the image represents a pigmentation gene associated with skin color, and it shows that a SNP, represented by the RS number, has two different variations, resulting in either a light or dark pigmentation. With the inclusion of more SNPs within that gene, we are able to discern between specific eye colors, such as blue and brown. And due to genetic information being inherited, we also see the conservation of SNPs between and within individuals. So therefore, we can analyze multiple SNPs within a panel and predict appearance by inferring the external physical characteristics. And due to the fact that the SNPs are conserved, we can also infer ancestry. Now, a company within America called Parabon uses this analysis to produce snapshot profiles, as can be seen in the images. They are able to infer skin color, eye color, hair color, and the presence of freckles. Now, something like this has great potential within the forensic field, especially when conventional DNA analysis fails. As previously mentioned, we need a reference sample or a forensic DNA database match for comparison because it works on a matching principle. Therefore, phenotyping can actually help generate new leads in homicides. They can narrow or broaden the suspect pool, as well as help identify victims that are beyond recognition and help identify mass casualty events where reference samples aren't readily available. Now, phenotyping has been used internationally, as can be seen in Australia, where they used phenotypic characteristics to help identify World War II soldiers. A case was also seen in the Madrid bombings, where phenotyping was used to identify a potential suspect. Louisiana used phenotyping to create a new suspect profile for a serial killer who was incorrectly identified by eyewitnesses. And the Toronto Police Service also used phenotyping within their cold cases. Now, seeing that this is used internationally, the application of phenotyping needs to be considered within South Africa. And this is where my research comes in. I'm investigating the legal, ethical, and social concerns of using phenotyping within South Africa, as well as the genetic viability. So, the legal issues concern with recent implementation of the DNA database match. We have legal constrictions on definitions of certain items. For example, the forensic DNA profile, as seen in this extract here, is restricted to not include any physical information about a person except for their sex. Now, the Act goes further to even describe what forensic DNA analysis is, restricting it to only being able to generate a DNA profile. Now, this is a very limiting definition, and it can actually limit any future development that our country may have. Now, international law is known to limit DNA forensic profiling to non-coding DNA regions. However, certain countries have made adaptations to their law to allow phenotyping. For example, the Netherlands have allowed for phenotyping specifically, limiting it to characteristics that have been present in an individual since birth. They are not allowed to infer any information about an individual that he or she may not be aware of themselves. The German Criminal Code does not express any limitations on non-coding sequences, and thus does not specifically prohibit trait-defining DNA. The United Kingdom also provides a service of physical appearance prediction and ethnicity prediction as a form of intelligence, and the United States has no legislation upon phenotyping. However, certain states have restrictions on what samples are allowed to be used. For example, you're not allowed to use any information stored on the database. However, analysis on new samples on new cases is allowed. Now, obviously, a major concern is whether or not DNA phenotyping is ethical. There's a major fear that it is seen as a privacy infringement. It's the fear of becoming a social form of security, and there's a big fear that these information will be open to the public. So where and how this information will be stored and who will have access of it needs to be considered. Now, these issues have been addressed in literature and suggest that phenotypic information should only be used for investigational purposes and therefore not be presented in court. The results should only be accessible to leading investigators and not be stored on any database. Now, it's further suggested that forensic phenotyping should be limited to external characteristics only, which is argued to be non-private information, since physical traits are visible to the public and could have been given by an eyewitness if there had been one. Now, there is a major concern of prejudiced racial profiling, and this could lead to even more discrimination. The use of phenotyping is also feared to make law enforcement even more dependent on racial identifiers, targeting at-risk populations. Now, the defense here is given that phenotyping shouldn't be seen as an argument that one race is more prone to committing a crime than another, and should be seen as simply evidence within that specific case, and thus less prone to discrimination because it's objective. Lastly, the genetic viability needs to be assessed. The accuracy of this technology has been questioned, since a single trait relies on multiple genes. However, an expert within the field has argued that certain genes, such as eye color and hair color, is easy to assess, since one gene is highly informative. Now, the informative value of these markers need to be assessed in multiple populations. A concern raised by Kay Kidd, who said that since these SNP panels are currently being used have been created using European and North American populations, might not work everywhere. So some of these issues have been addressed in recent research. A project conducted in Brazil analyzed 18 SNPs that is commonly used and found that only 2 were associated within their admixture population. A second study assessed ancestry informative markers with a focus on a gene that is associated with skin color. They concluded that aims are not 100% accurate within mixed populations, and reported that this specific gene showed difficulty between discerning between Asian and African descent. It's interesting to note that this is a gene that has one of the 2 SNPs present that was identified in the previous article. Now, these results need to be considered if we want to apply phenotyping within the South African population, since we have such a diverse variety of ancestries and visible traits. We also have the additional limitation of population classification that doesn't accurately define our diverse population and is still based on apartheid regime defined groupings. This is additional analysis that my research aims to determine by analyzing the genetic markers for skin color within the South African population in conjunction with an objective skin color measurement tool. So in conclusion, forensic phenotyping has great potential as a forensic investigative tool, especially in cases where conventional DNA profiling fails. It is able to narrow persons of interest pools. It is able to generate new leads for homicides, save time and resources. It is able to help identify victims that are beyond recognition and serves as a more objective form of information compared to eyewitness testimony. Considering that certain SNP panels may become a part of commercialized kits, these markers need to be evaluated within the South African population. Legal and ethical concerns need to be addressed, as well as the social value and possible discrimination has to be considered. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'll try and keep within the time. I think I'll see how things go. Right, so I'm going to be presenting on synchronicity between radio astronomy and forensic science. Now, it sounds like quite a bizarre topic, but hopefully there'll be some explanation on how this could be useful. Okay, so I'll start with some motivation, then get into challenges of big data and how that can be a similar problem in forensic science, and then go into some examples. I'll try and keep to a minimum of kind of complicated computing designs and maths and things. Okay, so the main problem here is that what this work that we've started on is really focused around is attempting to find solutions to ways by which one can process all the evidence and the implications in a more quick manner, do it less expensively, and do it more accurately, we hope, accurately, considering what results as a verdict. We don't seem to have said enough about cost. As an engineer, I know it's terrible to say, but we're always trying to do things kind of for less cost, for more function. So that's kind of what the topic is somewhat boarding around. Okay, so hopefully one can speed up, well, at least some ideas on how one might be able to speed up the process of going from the collection to the reporting procedure. But obviously, there's limits to where computers might help in those kind of decisions. Okay, in terms of the burden of proof, I sum that up as saying that it's a rather expensive undertaking. And it involves these things of criminal trials and things that are difficult to schedule, go on for possibly very long periods of time. Okay, much of these costs are also burdens to the state. So the various parties involved would hire their own lawyers, but the state, in many cases, in homicide investigations, they're having to foot the bill for a lot of the operations that are taking place. So what are some of the costs? And I haven't researched the various elements of costs, so please, anybody, you're welcome to correct me and make comments later on what the actual costs would be. But as per the small amount of reading I've done about the cost, it's things like hiring detectives, forensic experts, so you might want to have multiple opinions on a particular situation, hiring of expert witnesses, and many other costs that might be involved. Okay, there's this question, being something of a interested in astronomy, there's this thing of seeing further, and in astronomy we're always wanting to see further, to like the beginning of the universe, for one thing, and making predictions from where that initial starting point, what does that lead to? So I'm thinking surely seeing further is generally what you want, so you can get more insight into a situation. So an assumption, now me being somewhat of a novice in the understanding of forensics, I would maybe think that the more evidence, the more likely the truth will be discovered. Now I realize, of course, that that's not necessarily the case. But in reality, the more evidence, the more work is needed, the longer it takes, the more expense, the increasing likelihood of misdirection, and the problem of information overloading. So those are all challenges of reality. Okay, just the information overload aspect, that's something that fits very much with radio astronomy, at least, that there's, okay, I didn't put in the figure there, but there's about a few tenths of a percent, for example, that one would be interested in a particular visual in a radio, or in image captures. So there's usually a very tiny little piece of the data that you collect that is of any relevance to a, for example, a model that you're trying to check. So an assumption about the universe that you're wanting to prove. So it tends to be a tiny little piece of the massive amount of data that you've got to work with that's actually useful. And one's always trying to find problems by which you can filter out the stuff that you're not interested in and focus on the major aspects, at least what you understand to be contributing factors to what your hypothesis is. And unfortunately, in some cases, those filtering systems that we use in processing data kind of cuts out interesting nuggets of information that you wish you hadn't done before, because then somebody else comes up with that and publishes a paper on it. So there's those dangers of taking out information that you possibly want. So information overload is a difficult thing to deal with. Okay, in terms of a forensic aspect, there's the issues of decision making. So more information could possibly help with decision makings in a trial, in witness tracking, in validating of evidence, a whole lot of possibilities. Okay, but being a computer engineer and reading about how computer scientists are at least making use of forensic data, I tend to think how much can a computer actually help with these problems? And I should think quite a lot, and always when one brings a computer into the picture, there's this issue of maintaining a balance of sensibility and the ethics of what you do with the information and how you make use of it. You don't necessarily want to put in tools that lead to a more harmful and detrimental result. So some cliches, if I may use them, is that the failure of, for example, artificial intelligence systems, you might argue that, as the HAL system says, if anybody's a 2001 Space Oddity fan, HAL says that my failure can only be attributable to human error, which is a very common problem with computer software, as you've probably encountered before. Then there's the other one that dealing with all the information that one might be getting hold of, it leads to the issue of what do you do with that information, and getting a computer or computer-related system to make the responses maybe not what you want, as opposed to the Robocop suggestion. Okay. But the critical factor here, in policing and radio astronomy is there tends to be a knowledgeable human in the loop. So it's difficult to extract the human from the loop of how things operate. Okay, the reliance of computer power, that tends to be a thing where you might reduce the cost of the burden of proof. And for radio astronomy, that is undeniably a fact. So we're dealing with terabytes of data, and it would be terabytes of data in a couple of hours. Without a computer cutting out most of the stuff, it would be totally impossible to really make use of the information that we managed to get from radio telescope arrays. And the computing centers are a central part of making this system work. Just a quick snippet on what the radio astronomy situation and case study would be. That would be the SKA. I won't mention this for more than a few seconds, where we've got a whole lot of data collection sources, the antennas, and we've got 2 data centers and masses of computers. And the nice thing is that what engineers tend to like doing is to be able to sit in a comfortable computer, behind a computer in a comfortable situation, and then there's the dirty reality of the crew and all the dust, and in the forensic science case, that would be the diagnosis laboratories and things. So we would be sitting nicely isolated from the dirty realities. Okay, so the challenges of big data with SKA, it's summed up by the 4 V's, and I'm going to provide some illustrations of where those V's happen in forensics. So there's the variety, which is multiple dimensional data. So we've got a whole lot of different data that one wants to collect together to make decisions from. Then there's chances of error and comprehensive noise, which is the veracity. There's data collection at high speed, which would be nice to have higher speed for various types of data collection. But that I call the velocity. And a lot of data, which is the volume. So it's the 4 V's of big data. Then there's for forensics, there's a similar situation where there's a huge amount of variety. There's chances of missing data. There's the volume that's involved. Except I've changed this last point that based on the previous presentations and things that I've learned, that the volume and velocity might not be something that a computer solution can really help much with, but we can discuss that further. Tricks that can be used very quickly, there's these issues of tensors, non-Gaussian models, and graphs, graph theory, which I'll just giving this as nuggets of ideas and inspiration of and ways that there could be synchronicity with radio astronomy. I call them the usual suspects of big data. So tensors, these are kind of multidimensional vectors. So hopefully everybody knows what a vector is. But instead of having a sequence of numbers as a vector, there could be a sequence of data sets. And the example here is, so if you can imagine that grid without the planet in the middle, from a tensor calculation, you could predict that there is some kind of massive body in that location based on the data that you gather. And from that, you might make a prediction that that is a planet or some kind of body out in space. Okay, tensors in forensic processes, this would be a whole lot of input sequences that you would be able to provide and do matching between these. Okay, so in this kind of non-dirty environment where the computer could provide some suggestions on what the possible suspects and causes of a event might be. Okay, so the main features of tensors is dealing with the variety and the veracity of information. With signal processing graphs, this is essentially can represent the same data, but it provides a more, for some algorithms, a more effective means of dealing with the data. So it's breaking up the data in different ways so that you can more easily break it into subparts. Okay, for a comparison here is that, for example, in radio astronomy, what one often does with graphs is to break a big data set into different pieces. You model the general relations between the subgroupings. So you can think of those as subclusters of stars instead of individual stars. And so between those subclusters, you can make very good approximations of how the, for example, galaxy formation would happen. In the forensic angle, there's a whole lot of relations, for example, between the victim and people the victim might know, which could lead to a whole lot of other relations between these people and other objects or circumstances. So graphs could provide a good means to represent that. Okay, non-Gaussianity is just the aspect of how you expect data to behave and expectations of how datum are related to one another. And the main thing here is that there's the general assumption that data is Gaussian, which fits this kind of bell curve structure, but in many cases you don't have that situation happening when you've got many different sensors, which ends up being non-Gaussian. The problem with non-Gaussian data, trying to put into a Gaussian solution, is that it can skew your findings and lead to the wrong conclusions. Okay, I've got my conclusions. So essentially there are similarities between the data, a lot of differences as well, like in the way that data is collected. There's the issues of big data and challenges associated with this. And there's the newer challenges of what type of algorithms and how can existing algorithms, which are more in the traditional sense of what one wants to do with it, be adapted for use in forensic applications. And to just end with, there's, from my perspective and my limited understanding of the problem, I can only really contribute more questions, which at least some of these I might be able to ask at a later stage. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think we're all for computers making our lives easier. So thanks for illuminating ways in which that might happen in this field. We have about 40 minutes for questions. I think we'll take the same ways in which we've been doing it previously. So can I just have an indication and then we'll go down. Okay. I see 4.
Thank you. Hi, Lucia from the University of Notre Dame. I have a question for Gráinne. I hope I just didn't butcher your name. I do apologize. I'm not an English speaker, at least not my first language. I loved your presentation. You're very courageous. I couldn't do what you do, so that's awesome. I was wondering, so you said kind of in passing that these police that you've been engaging with have some kind of combat training. And I was wondering if they also get some kind of human rights training. Because, you said danger, there's a lot of perception in what danger is. And so part of that is like how you construct the other, right? In your relationship with others, how do you view them? Do you view them as your enemies as criminals, as gang members, or do you view them as people with personnel integrity rights? And so thinking a little bit about how those things impact then, the development of the rule of law, democracy, and so on. I don't know. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. And then another quick one that's if you have a sense of what the ratio is of police killings vis-a-vis citizens killed by police here in South Africa. Thank you.
Nandi, I have an interest in genetics, so I would just like to know more of your genetics part of your study as opposed to the ethical side. And also, what are you going to use as a measure of skin color?
Hi, Sipon Folozia again from the Division of Forensic Medicine. I've got a question for Gráinne regarding what are your thoughts about SAPS members who are patrolling an area, who switch off their blue lights when there's a gang-related shooting that happens in the area? From our understanding, that it's a common practice in the Cape Flats that patrolling police officers deliberately switch off their, those ambient blue lights that they have, non-flashing lights, but they deliberately switch them off at the time that there is a confirmed or known gang shooting incident that occurs at that time. And the second question goes to Simon, and it's more of a question and a comment regarding the algorithms that he spoke about. Do you think, Simon, that the astronomy algorithms or the algorithms that handle data should have a capability of self-teaching? In other words, of being able to verify their own data or their own outputs and teaching themselves how to look at data? Because I've got a feeling that algorithms are static. In other words, they're written as a code, and the code remains as what the author wrote it, and unless someone goes and writes it again or improves on it, it remains what it is. So do you think maybe there's a potential for self-coding codes or self-correcting or learning algorithms, which can then by themselves, as time goes, teach themselves how to look at data? Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm also questions for Gráinne and Lorna. Yes, our rate of deaths of police as a result of being in their job is high compared to the rest of the world. But if you compare it to the deaths of young men in South Africa, actually 4 times fewer are dying amongst the police if you compare it. So we need to contextualize within a very violent society where actually they're less likely to die of homicide than an ordinary young man between the ages of 15 and 60. So we need to think of that. And also the question of the person over there. In fact, the rate of killings by police is 9 times higher than the deaths of police in the course of duty. So we also need to think about that. In fact, when I hear police killings, I think of people being killed by police, not the other way around. And I also wonder the extent to which Heisenberg is operating in your research, where your presence in the police vehicle is encouraging a kind of bravado, the kind of the action men, and whether you've picked up anything of that nature. I certainly understand that foot patrols with only 4 people at night is a very unusual thing to happen. So I wonder to what extent that's happening. And Lorna, if you could just comment a little bit about the killings by mothers of their daughters, whether you had any thoughts on that and what interventions we might think about in the gendered nature of our society.
I just want to push a little bit on Jean's question. So it's Gráinne. I think it is important when, ethnography on at ethnography and policing, ethnography in prisons, I certainly felt this very much in the research that I've done in both of those contexts. Much of what's been written in South African police has been done from the back of the police van, right? And as an ethnographer, it's a very interesting position to be in. And you see a lot, in a sense, the police give you a kind of protection to be able to be in those spaces as much as there's a threat and a danger in being there. But it does position you in a very particular kind of way and place. And so to push a little bit on Jean's question, what does it mean to think about positioning yourself outside of the police and looking at the police as a way of thinking about ethnography of policing, and how does that shift and change? And I felt in your presentation that there was something about a kind of police-centric reading, and I know that is part of what ethnography does, is to read from the inside, but there's a whole other way of speaking about and representing police work in township space from the vantage of outside of the police van, looking at it from the outside. So just your comments on that ethnographic perspective. And then for Nandi, a question about ethics and how you're reading ethics, because there's a way in which one can read ethics from within a legal framework and from within a kind of bioethical discussion. But there are a whole range of ethical and political conversations that are going on beyond that around race and racial marking, from critical race theory to histories of anti-racism. So how does one think about the limits of reading ethics as a project from a medical school position, is the question.
Thank you. Roxanne Jacob from the MRC. Just two short questions. The first one is for Lorna. What was happening with the other 55% of the cases that were not linked to child abuse? And the second one is for Nandi. Do you think that phenotyping, do you think that South Africa is ready for phenotyping, the technology and the implications thereof?
So thank you for that. So as a Jean first. So the majority of those deaths, the killing of daughters by their mothers, those are newborns in the vast majority, and they're either actively killed or abandoned. And by far, in the majority of cases, mothers are the caregivers. There's often not a father present. So I think that's the reason for that. As to why there's more girls being murdered at that very young age than boys, I'm sure we can all offer some opinions on that, but I'm going to leave that to my social scientist colleagues. The second question was what's happening to the 55% not related to fatal child abuse. So those are children just being killed or being killed by people other than their caregivers. So it's mainly the older children, and it's mainly those shooting each other or stabbing each other or those kinds of, yeah.
Okay, so the first question I'm going to answer is the skin color measurement. So what I'm using a special instrument called a dermal spectrometer. And what it does, it actually reads your pigmentation in your skin by reading your melanin index. So through light absorption, it gives a unit. And so that's an objective unit that's measured on a scale. So that's my objective skin color measurement. And then the genetics part is I'm using a snapshot assay. So this has been used in other studies, and this provides me with, how can I say it? It enables me to see the certain variation at the specific location. So I don't want to get too genetics here, but I'm able to see at the location that I'm looking at what variation occurs, and this then using other instrumentation gives me like a sort of graph, so I can see what SNP variation is occurring, and then hopefully I'm going to try and evaluate the relationship between what variations occur between the individuals and their melanin index reading that I've taken. The ethics concern, yes, ethics is a very big topic. So up to this point, because I'm still investigating, a lot of my research has just been ones that have been done in literature and what other experts and other people have brought up and have discussed. Mainly it's been from a genetic side, so relating how genetic information and that ethical side comes through more than the racial side per se. But yes, that's a very wide field that needs a lot more discovery into it, especially when considering difference between how a person identifies themselves ethically compared to ancestrally. And I found like a lot of papers just discerning different, researchers explaining things differently and how it relates to the individual. So yeah, that is something that I want to go further into. So this is still like the preliminary results that I have. I hope that answers your question. Then for South African, is South Africa ready for phenotyping? I think that before it can be implemented, the markers need to be evaluated within our population. So that hasn't been done yet. So that's like the start where I'm starting the pilot study. And even before, like even if we find that these markers are informative, the law needs to change. Currently, because of the law, we can't do anything. And then the methods need to be forensically validated before they can be incorporated into investigations. So I think phenotyping might be very beneficial for South Africa, but right now we can't do it legally, and just because we don't have the validation at the moment. But the technology is available, so it doesn't have to do that we can't perform the tests. We just need to make sure that the results we get are informative enough.
Yeah, so I had one question about algorithms developing themselves, really. And my response on that is that, generally speaking, there's two movements, and this very much connects with artificial intelligence, which is one of my areas of interest. There's essentially two movements to artificial intelligence and algorithms that can develop themselves. So these are essentially logic programming and logic design. So that's where it's the human that designs the program. And expert systems, for example, would be an example where you describe the diagnoses that the expert, like a human expert, would use, and that would be programmed generally in code into the program. The other movement is self-modifying programs and automated learning. And now there's a lot of contention between these two movements, and a lot of expert systems actually combine elements of both. The thing with self-modifying systems is that if you look at it at a high level, it's something like a function approximator. And the problem with function approximators is that they often don't cover all the cases. So you put in a new situation, and it's still code that's running. The code doesn't know how to deal with the new situation. And so it might very well make the wrong assumptions. So yes, these kind of things can work maybe 99% of the time, but there's situations where it doesn't work, and it could be catastrophic decisions that it leads to. There's the other thing, which is coincidentally gene programming, and computers we've got an approach for doing that where you can describe a computer program and then you kind of mix it around with other programs, and hopefully after many iterations you get to a program that provides a better result. So with those, you've got a training set that you make the program learn the training set, and after a number of iterations it gets better results of using that training set. Then you throw in different data sets to see how it performs on that based on the training set. And those algorithms, there's in these kind of forensic cases, they haven't shown a great level of success yet, but it's a matter of getting more dimensions to work with them. Hopefully that's been a long enough example for the answer.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Gráinne is an Irish name. It's Irish for grace, but I'm definitely a Gráinne. I'm not a Grace. I'll try and answer the questions the best I can. The human rights training issue, I haven't been into the academies yet. I'm hoping to get in to see what they do at the moment. I'm really working off what I'm being told. There's a huge emphasis on fitness, and any of the police will tell you, you know, they basically run these guys for the length of their training. And surprisingly enough, when they come out, the weight goes on because they're not running 12 hours a day. The human rights issue seems to sort of come through in issues like the Section 49, the use of force, that you'll hear the guys talking about it from the perspective of, you know, we can't even draw our firearms now, we can't even protect ourselves. And it's that understanding of human rights. It goes back, I think, to Sebastian touched on it in terms of that kind of militaristic type understanding. And it's schizophrenic in South Africa at the moment in terms of, and I'm delighted Steven Pinker was mentioned, because I'm a huge believer in just reinforce it with the correct use of the word. And the idea of this war on crime drives me nuts. It's a bugbear of mine because, okay, there's that association with the militarization of the police, but it's not as much that as much as the spaces that creates for the lack of proper policing to take place. And it creates that schizophrenic conversation for the police themselves that it's a war on crime, so obviously any method is applicable, versus the human rights issue. I can't say I've heard the use of emotional intelligence in their training as of yet. It's something that I have no doubt there's going to be loads of room for, if we can actually get through this idea of it's not a war against anything. Any wars that people go into, there's always a loss. You fight for something, not against it. And that's, I think, with police, and that's where we have to start looking forward. The other issue, I suppose, with that and the human rights is in a township setting, and again, my experience hasn't taken me anywhere else as of yet. Again, it was touched on, this idea of the police of being us and them. It's very different. It's us and us. They're policing their own. And when I ask about, you know, the idea of policing somewhere close to home, I mean, it has been said to me that, you know, it's very difficult. My parents live in this area. I don't want to do something that it's going to go back onto my parents. Or there was another comment one of the girls said to me that people expect favours. And of course, research scientist, what do you mean by favours? They expect you to give them something. So I think it's not solely an us and us, but that element is there as well. That just sort of, it creates that kind of contradictory environment for the police to actually work in, but without a doubt, the human rights has to start bubbling through. The blue lights issue, thanks very much for that. No, I haven't heard of that. I haven't experienced it, possibly because some of the vehicles I've been in don't actually have lights that work, and that's the truth. It is definitely a form of avoidance, and it's something I can look for now, so thank you very much. Jean and Kelly, if it's okay, I kind of answer you together. Thanks for answering that question, Jean, by the way, because it's one I purposely try and avoid when it comes to the spotlight on police killings. And if you read any of the parliamentary papers in relation to murder of police from ministers themselves and people on the committee, the first sentence will be in relation to the murder of police officers, and then it'll be followed by the number that the police killed. The spotlight suddenly becomes an interrogation lamp. I understand why, because it is an issue, and it's an issue in the majority of countries. In America, exact same issue. It is definitely going to feed into the conversation, but I am stubbornly keeping it as a spotlight as opposed to an interrogation lamp for the purpose of my own research. The knock-on effect, yeah, it definitely come up as an issue. Sometimes I hate being associated with the police because we all have biases. I think the most obvious form for me in terms of, I thought it was, you know, I'm going to have my own biases here going in as someone with an experience in policing. And then I got the indemnity forms faxed into the university. And there was quite a few of them, and the reality started to kick in that you're actually going to start doing this. And one of the girls who is a doctor now said to me, "So what are you afraid of? You're a cop." And I looked at her and said, "Really?" And she said, "I have absolutely no idea why you said that." We all have biases attached. There has been papers written with Van Manen in relation to the pros and cons of it. I think the pros, accessibility without a doubt. There's this idea that you've got the keys and you get to open the doors. In some respects, yes. I think negotiating the access was possibly a bit easier than I know some of my colleagues have experienced. But the reality is negotiation in an ethnographic perspective is a day-to-day issue. And the responses really varied in terms of, when I met senior management on 2 occasions, the first thing they asked me, there was no hello, good afternoon, Mulvaney. It was, have you signed the indemnity forms? And yet when I was introduced to the operational members on the ground, the first thing they asked me was, do you have a bulletproof vest? Do you have a gun? The very different responses in terms of conducting research in the field. I think the knock-on effect and the reality of me being in the back of the car, Amanda, you'll be delighted to know the Kyle-Leach report has had an effect at the ground level. The foot patrols, I was sitting here trying to think, many times have I go out on foot patrol? In 6 months, sitting here now, I count 5 with different, 2 different occasions with the same people. Some officers are more prone to foot patrols. They tend to lean towards those who are in the area a lot longer and know their way around. The Kyle-Leach report has been quoted at senior management meetings to take back to the station as far as recommendations go. And one of those recommendations is contact with the community. I'm not saying it's a eureka moment in terms of everybody's doing it now, but the foot patrols are starting to take place, and I think it should be acknowledged that it has had some impact. You know, the ripples are starting to come through. Yeah, the quicksand environment of ethnographic work. Yeah, I sometimes feel schizophrenic in the car myself because you're watching events unfold in front of you, and I suppose for me, I can't relate to this form of policing. I mean, I think I reduced a detective to cry at one point when he said, "What's crime like in your country?" In Ireland, the population is the same size as Cape Town, 4.5, 5 million people, with a police service of just under 13,000. And we had 47 murders last year. And the poor detective said to me, he said, "Was that for the month?" I said, no, that was for the year. The volume that the police deal with here, I mean, I can't relate to it. So it's very hard to sit in a car and relate to how policing is conducted here because I have no point of reference bar the fact they're in a uniform. Now, there will be occasions where I'll go, right, okay, yeah, how they process prisoners. There's some processes that you'll relate to, but policing isn't about processes. It's about relationships. I mean, the Kyle-Leach Commission, I was a permanent fixture there because it became my history of policing this country. And I would love to say that there was something in it that I went, no way. There wasn't. When you strip away the issues that were there, it was processes layered on top of the basic nugget, communication. People weren't being told what was going on with their cases. Yes, dockets got lost. Now, that would be highly unusual. But I'm not dealing with 22,000 dockets. So, yeah, it is going to be an issue. I think it'll be balanced in terms of I'm renowned for, in my professional life, then when someone says, you know, he did this and this, he's alleged to have done this, my 2 favourite words are prove it. In every sense of the word, and I think that's, from a social science standpoint, prove it. When I actually get to the end of the research, I'll have to sit down and basically just drown myself in my data and see what it says and see how it relates to my initial perceptions of what I thought I'd see, because it's the only way I can do it is to diarise it, my feelings, you know, the usual stuff you associate with ethnography, that to be as honest as I can, I'm hoping that the observations will bubble through. Sorry, I kind of went off on one there. I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you. We have time for another round. Are there any more questions?
Thanks. I just have a quick question for Gráinne. In your research, did you look at the impact of police shootings for policing in general? Because it seems that what happens when there's a concentration of police deaths and there are funerals and the minister and the national commissioner attends, and it's sort of consistent over the past 5-odd years, going even further back, that typically that's when the most controversial, most war on crime comments are made. So it's just really your impressions on whether the deaths of police officers have an impact on crime fighting in general, or is this just political rhetoric? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Those were great presentations. Just a comment and a question. Gráinne gets the comment. Your research is sounding fascinating. Obviously, I have some idea what you're doing, but I think you're doing work which will help inform our thinking about policing for the next years ahead, maybe the next decade. So keep at it, and we look forward to hearing the results once you've immersed yourself. Nandi, I'm afraid I've got another question for you. I think that if this is the beginning of a longer project for you, especially in more social sciencey contexts, you're going to get asked this a lot, so you should probably get interrogated now and get some of it out the way so that the answers are easier in the future. I guess I'm interested in this idea, as others are, that there's an objective measurement of skin tone. How perhaps a melanin reading can be objective, but how will people interpret that, especially in the South African context where we've historically had these 4 quote-unquote race categories? At what point does a melanin level take us into another? And so I'm just wondering what practicality it would have, other than reinforcing ideas about this is a white reading, this is a colored reading, this is an Indian reading, this is an African reading, or can it take us out of race thinking? Any thoughts on that?
Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting. I'm going to try keep my disparate thoughts together. Prof, this is really associated with your presentation. I think you brought up a very good point of, obviously, blood alcohol concentrations and at what point are we actually going to, in our environment, I think, start analyzing these types of cases and look at particularly toxicological data in pediatric cases. Because I think as toxicologists, we always say, you know, children are not just young adults from a tox point of view. They obviously, you know, pharmacokinetics and dynamics in children are a lot different. So I think in those situations, we have to also ask ourselves the question of maybe it's not just blood alcohol that we need to be looking at, but obviously the toxicological data. You know, in younger individuals where it's things like your over-counter medication in terms of, you know, your antihistamines and paracetamol and those types of things. That's really where, you know, the investigation should lie in terms of the younger individuals. And then obviously as you move towards the teenage years, you're obviously extending into different drugs of use and abuse. So that was, and then just expanding from that, I think that comes down a lot of the times to the discretion of the pathologist, at least nowadays. And I think also the nature of the contribution to death and really the bearing that has on the actual determination of cause of death. You know, yes, the gunshot wound was the cause of death. Is the fact that is methamphetamine toxicity a contributory cause to death, and where does that lie in our medical and legal system? So my questions for you are, do you think we're missing these toxicological contributions to death? And do you think that's just going to actually create a more complex environment in terms of for our pathologists at least, and for our legal system as well? And then I was wondering if you had any, I can't remember if you had any tox data in there, but did you have any fetal or infant deaths that were associated with maternal drug use or abuse? And then in your natural cases, I know we're treading a fine line here, but do you think we have mistaken any of our natural cases due to the complexities associated with our obviously tox analyses in our labs nowadays? So do you think some of those natural cases may have been toxicologically related, but we are obviously faced with severe limitations in our labs with regards to analyzing and testing. So it's often a lot easier just to say it is natural because you found something, and that goes back to the contributory versus causative. Sorry, that was a bit long.
I've got three short issues. The first one is to Gráinne. Thank you very much for bringing attention to the real issues. Suicide is 3 times more common than the number of policemen killed, so that's a much bigger issue. But we don't hear about it or very little. They're dying more in road traffic crashes and more off-duty than on-duty, so it's interesting. I think Johnny Steinberg, he published on this, and he says that the rate of policemen dying was really Azerbaijan is 4 times lower than in the normal population. So there is no war on police. Actually, they are protected. So that was the first issue. The second one is directed at Lorna. You showed in your one slide that you had suicide in the age category 5 to 9. And I would just put my question mark there because I think that's a very young age. Children still got magic thinking. So I think I would be very careful writing a 5-year-old child who died and then say it was suicide. I would really look at the circumstances. And then the third point I would like to suggest to Simon. The presentation was very high up in the air, and I would like to have some practical suggestions from your side. Is maybe electronic devices like PCs and cell phone signals. Could you write software which could sort of like detect essential information in this massive amount of data which could be related to a murder case? Those are my points. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all again for another very informative and exciting presentation. Gráinne, I'm really upset that you didn't tell us what happened to the man who ran away and was being frog marched and whether anyone was actually rescued. But I hope to get that story from you offline. Interestingly, I recall a conversation with you right at the beginning of the Gráinne Commission where you were shocked at how the police dealt with vigilante violence and that they didn't have a strategy. And your retelling of the story now seems to confirm that there isn't it, but you're in much more of an understanding position of how these events happen. My question is then for Lorna, and I was really interested to see how you are leading this investigative type of task team to review all cases of child-related deaths and how that had led to better investigation. Again, drawing from the Gráinne Commission of Inquiry, it was very apparent that many of those forensic reports or pathology reports were not actually followed up or collected, and very little investigation had happened. And so I missed that part of your presentation and would like to have known what your success rate, if you could put it like that, was. And whether there's also any scope for having those kinds of teams looking at other kinds of death categories, I suppose, murder categories.
Thank you all. There's a lot of information to process. I just wanted to comment on 2 things, Gráinne, about attitude of the police. I think we've touched on it a bit with human rights and communication. But, for example, having watched the Americana film and the way the police looked at those corpses and called them pussies and laughed at the fact that some had muti on them and it didn't work. And it was just so shocking of their attitudes towards the dead that I just wondered whether that was kind of going to come into your research or your comments. And also the fact Leon yesterday talked about the importance of empathy as opposed to self-esteem with children in prisons, and is there space for empathy with the militarization of the police? And then Lorna, gosh, I'd really like to get a copy of your paper or your presentation because there was just so much information in it, and I'm working mostly in the area of youth, adolescents, males. But I just wondered about the geographic distributions because from what I gathered, yours was a national study from 38 mortuaries nationally, and you know, we had earlier comments about the West and the Eastern Cape having the highest incidences of violence and homicide, and whether that fitted in or whether you have that information available, or is it all national statistics? I hope I've interpreted what you said correctly. Thanks.
Thank you for the questions. We are running very close to lunch, so if I can request short answers as far as possible from the panelists.
Thanks, I'll try and be brief. Guy, in relation to the impact of police murders and killings and assaults on members themselves, as part of the research, I didn't actually mention it in the presentation, I attend the police memorial and funeral services of members killed, which has been 8 in the last year. And I'm interested, how do you go back into work when you've been to the scene of your colleague being shot dead? Like, how does anybody do something like that? And I may be able to kill 2 birds, excuse the pun, but 1 stone here in relation to, there's a normalisation of what the police here see, the violence, the incidents, and it feeds into this confusion of this is how we should deal with people because we've normalised it. And it's that narrative that I'm trying to understand. How did we get to a point where when we speak about the murder of police, the police themselves say it's an occupational hazard. They wear their bulletproofs because when I die, my family get X amount of money. Not if I die, when I die. And it's a narrative that you hear that it has become part of their story. Certainly huge issues as far as Marikina, and I mean, it's a daily thing. It's a daily struggle. I refuse to use the war, the fight analogy. But I think like conferences like this constant spotlight on it, it throws the shadow, it casts that long shadow in terms of developing how we go forward with it. With the funerals and the services, they're fascinating to go to, and it's not because I have a morbid interest in funerals. Monique Mark's work looks at unions, and to the unions presented at the memorial services of members. I think the first one I went to, I caught about 50 flies in my mouth because the union member got up onto the stage and he started his, I don't think eulogy is the right word, statement perhaps, that what we really have to do, he said, we have to go back to before apartheid. We've got to go back to when it was like apartheid. And I thought, I obviously misheard that now. That idea, that force of power of the police, that this is how you command respect. And that respect feeds back down to what I will keep going on about for the next 4 years. It's the relationship issue of how you get that respect. And it feeds into the empathy issue, that understanding, sympathy, the empathy, how you relate to people. It's going to be central in terms of my own focus on the research. But yeah, I think I kind of answered in a short enough time.
Yeah, so I can respond quickly about, yes, I understand my talk, provide more information. One of the biggest problems that we have is that we do have lots of security cameras, but the imagery is very poor on them. And it's very difficult to identify the students from these pictures. Well, most of the time it's not actually students that steal things. So that's one of the main purposes. And also to develop open source solutions. So we're thinking with the SKA project, we're developing a lot of open source free software. And there could be a means by which we can leverage some of that software that we're developing in order to help protection services, for example. So making available free software that could lead into the criminal justice system, at least to cut some of the costs. But now I don't know enough about the problems at present to gather a large enough set of parameters that would be needed. So at present it's fairly small stages, working from the more campus-based situation, and see where that might be able to be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so what I first just want to state is pigmentation is a scale. So there are so many variations of skin color, and they can't be boxed into these groups that our population classifications try to do. So the melanin index actually takes into consideration that scale. And obviously there's overlap of people having similar melanin index scales, but being in different population groups. So this goes beyond the population group. And so the comment about how we'll interpret this is the melanin index, I'm not going to be telling you that our suspect is a 30.7 MI and go look for him. It's going to be displayed visually. So within my presentation, when I showed the snapshot Parabon profiles, they had a scale. So they can take the melanin index and rate it on a color scale, a tone, to visually display the skin tone that you perceive. So then investigations won't be saying like, we're looking for a colored individual. Because what does that actually mean? There's so many variations between people that identify them as colored. So that doesn't actually have that much value to it, where if I can give you a picture, a visual representation of what it would look like, it's a lot more informative. And so I think that actually breaks our boxes that we've set up. I hope that answers it quite short.
Thank you. So I'll start here. We didn't look at provincial differences. I think that was your only question. Otherwise, come and talk to me during lunch, because I can't remember if you asked anything else. And then in terms of collection of reports, in terms of using the information that we have, is it being used properly, I think was your question. And is there scope for other teams to be established for other causes of death investigation? So the information that we do provide, and it's all part of the investigation. So the investigation is only as strong as the weakest link, and we like to think that we're providing the strongest link. And it is unfortunately usually the police link that fails us in our investigations. So we have a monthly meeting as a forensic pathology service with the police provincial executive, except they never come. So they send somebody who, they delegate somebody else to come who doesn't actually have authorization to make any decisions or do anything. And we're not quite sure that the information gets back to the level it needs to. But at that meeting, it's reported every month how many investigating officers were at the mortuary with us for the investigation of each of our cases. Did we get information from them? And it's about a 25 to 35% attendance of a police person at the mortuary for investigation. That doesn't mean to say that that's the correct police person who should be there attending, or that police person actually knows anything about what they're the case that they're attending about. We have set up with the provincial office a weekly collection of PM reports. So the PM reports get collected and get taken to the provincial office. And then the detectives need to come to the provincial office, or I think they get summoned to come and collect their post-mortem reports because of the fact that they weren't being collected. However, they've got to go from the police docket to the prosecutor before any intelligent questions can be asked about, well, what does this mean and what did you find, especially if they weren't at the autopsy with us. So there is a big lack of communication. And so we found from the child death reviews that this makes a big difference. So if we can talk to the investigator, both the police person and the prosecutor immediately, we share that information and then they know what they're investigating and what to look out for, etc. So to answer your question, should other death review teams be set up? Yes, if we need to set them up for each and every. Give me about another 20 pathologists and a couple of PhD interns, and we'll do a great job. But at the moment, it's impossible. But the next one that we're looking at setting up is for femicides. I mean, it should have been my first one I set up, but I got dragged, as I said, I got dragged in with the kids. But I think the next one would be for femicides. Sebastian, yes, we agree. We agreed. Suicides in 5 to 9 year olds. I think there were 3, if I recall correctly, and I think there were 8. There were 8 to 9 year olds. They definitely are suicides. So we've looked at them, and it is shocking to everybody in the team. How can we? But it is happening. It's not unknown. It's not unheard of. But thank you for the caution. Bronwyn, I'll talk to you. We talk at length, Bronwyn and I, about this. And so, just for the general public, of course, toxicology should be taken in every single case that is admitted to our mortuary, because it will, whether it has a direct contribution to the cause of death or not, it will have contributions to the circumstances of that death. And those circumstances are not even being taken into account now. So things like, might not be the best thing to say, but did you make yourself more of a victim because you were under the influence of some or other drug? Was there an interaction with something else that we wouldn't have even thought about if we had not done a toxicology screen on you? And also, because it's available and has been for a very long time, each and every investigation should have it, but we can't, and that's the bottom line. We can't, we don't. At the moment, it's not our agency. We give it to somebody else to do. We take all of the samples and give it to another agency, and they are between 8 and 10 years behind, so we'll never get the results, even of the things that we're taking now. And if we do, and when we do, the results, they've now tested something that's been sitting somewhere for 5 years, so none of us actually believe the results anyway. So if anybody wants, if there's some advocacy that comes out of this, it would be around, let's make sure that toxicology testing and analysis is looked at in this country, so that everybody is afforded that opportunity when they die, but also for the living. So if you're a victim of or a perpetrator of any kind of crime, so say you're a rape survivor, there is nobody gets tested for drugs. Nobody. The doctor might take the blood thinking that they're going to put it somewhere and it's going to be sent somewhere. It does not exist. So no matter what the national protocols say around rape survivors will have full toxicological testing and blood alcohol and all the rest, it doesn't happen. But we can continue. I don't know if I answered you, Bronwyn, on everything. Sure, we're missing natural cases. Sure, we're not testing. We're not testing for drugs, so if we think it's a natural case. So literally, if you want to kill your spouse, come and talk to us. We'll tell you exactly how to do it, and you'll get away with it, because we're not testing. But yeah, I mean, in some of the cases, especially with the kids where we did have a suspicion, and we have tested for something, and having said that the agency that does it for us is so far behind, we've got a UCT Department of Pharmacology who's doing screening for us, and we're getting not how much of the drug, but that the drug is present. And yes, in some of those cases, we found that there were little children that had been poisoned. That looked like a completely natural case. But there was something that alerted the pathologist at the time to take the analysis. If there was nothing, then we would have missed it. So, that answers the question. Sorry, I'm going into much.
Thank you to everyone for indulging us and having a slightly extended panel. I think you'll agree it's been a fascinating one. And if we can please just thank our excellent panelists.